WFG and the people above him have made lots of money. Now, again, if you remember, and this is what we've been hoping to see evidence about, is that Mr. Olson said that he could no longer tolerate working at WFG. So his side of the argument is that WFG has been doing wrong things, and that's why he's leaving to go start GFI. And this was my hope from the beginning, that he was going to come out and have some explanation about that, of what is it that's going on behind the scenes of WFG that people can't see. And so I haven't seen him go into that, so I'm hoping that at some point we get to see some of those complaints. The only ones that we saw were kind of from Cofield, but those all came out to not be true. So I'm wondering what it is that they actually have. And so now he's saying that in his attempt to exit, WFG stopped him. He first tried to transfer his hierarchy to his wife, Ms. Olson, under the Heritage Program. But when he told WFG of his plan, WFG purported to cancel the spousal transfer. So what would be interesting is if they have any information of what was actually said in this meeting. I'm assuming he sat down with WFG and said, hey, I don't know what exactly he explained. Did he say, hey, I want to start another company, and so I'm going to transfer this to my wife? But them knowing Eric Olson's perfected the anchor leg strategy, well, of course, I could see why they would say, well, we don't really want you to do that. If you're going to go start a competing company and move people over, we don't want you to be able to straddle the fence on both sides. So from WFG's standpoint, I can kind of see that, but I can also kind of see it from Eric Olson's standpoint. He goes, well, I'm kind of stuck here. What do I do? And that they didn't allow him to be able to do that transfer. And then he sought to sell his business at WFG, as many of his predecessors had done, including Rob Day, who had sold Mr. Olson's part of his book for $5 million in 2020. But Olson told WFG of his plan. WFG eliminated that program too, after it became clear that Mr. Olson would not stay under any conditions. So I'm assuming in this meeting, since it says here that Mr. Olson was not going to stay under any conditions. So it sounds like the disagreement was Olson wanted to keep his income with WFG, obviously, but then also go start another company. And that's where we get into the agent agreement around, okay, who's right and who's wrong, the non-solicitation versus a non-compete clause, and that's kind of where the argument is happening. So WFG fired him for allegedly breaching the restrictive covenants of his contract. WFG then took over his income stream. Mr. Day resumed getting payments from the very business that he had sold Mr. Olson for $5 million. So in here, it's kind of interesting, right? Because he was fired for cause. If you remember, we were looking at the NDAs from Cofield, and I have that in the members area if you want to see that too. But that was all the way back to October-ish, maybe even September, that they were doing NDAs for people. So it seems like they already had this plan in place. And if you remember when Sandra actually filed the motions to start GFI, it was long before the January termination date. And they were at like 4,000 agents in their first month, or maybe 5 weeks or so from actually being open. So it seems like obviously WFG knew there was an exodus of people. When you have people like Paul Hart leaving and Bayona, and you're seeing all this stuff, and people are seeing what they had on social media as far as the top agents moving over, and that whole kind of campaign that GFI was putting on, I'm sure that alluded to WFG of what was happening. And so at that point, they terminate the code number to figure out what's going on at that point, because that keeps him from having access to all of that stuff inside of WFG's system. So there's a difference between them stopping this for an individual, like not allowing him to do it, and not allowing all WFG agents to do it, which I don't think is what actually happened. I think what actually happened was they got an idea of what Eric wanted to do, and so they stopped it specifically for him. And so when WFG filed the instant case with Mr. and Mrs. Olson for violating restrictive covenants in their contracts, it then separately sued Ms. Olson's business, GFI, in Wyoming, making identical claims at the same time. WFG then began threatening people who worked for Mr. Olson with lawsuits under the same restrictive covenants to shill any hope of ever escaping WFG. And again, this kind of brings up the argument. And I kind of relate it to marriage, and obviously it's not the same thing, but some people were saying in the comments, they're like, well, you don't own people. Well, that's true. In a marriage, you also don't own somebody, but you make a covenant with them. And so there's a difference between getting a divorce and then having another person, right? Another spouse, another woman, right? And then there's a difference between still being in the marriage and having another woman. And those are two very different topics, almost identical in what's happening, but the way the contract is broken is kind of what's important. And I think that's WFG's side of it. It's like, we were still married and you were then cheating. That's probably a terrible analogy, but you guys kind of understand what I'm saying. Whereas WFG is saying, well, if you would have just terminated your contract, then you can go do what you want to do, but you don't be married to me and then have another woman. And that's kind of where all of this debate is happening, and the argument is. But what Olson is saying is that, well, that's not fair because under the California Code 16600, WFG breach of contract claim therefore fails in the matter of law. So he's basically saying that our marriage agreement didn't count because according to California, you're allowed to cheat and there's no obligations to that, is kind of the analogy. More so it's a non-compete clause that they're kind of arguing over. And so he's not denying that he did any of it. He's just saying that he should be allowed to do it because according to California, that's okay. Apparently you can do anything in California. So, and even if any of those covenants could be enforceable, WFG fails to allege facts that could presumably demonstrate a breach of these covenants. There are no allegations that identify how or what confidential information Mr. and Mrs. Olsons are alleged to having. No statements as to how or what allegedly they said disparaging about WFG. WFG other claims fails for the same reason. They are improperly pleaded, and most depend on WFG being able to enforce an unlawful contract. Its claim for tortious interference lacks any identifiable independently wrong act. The civil conspiracy claim lacks any allegation of any underlying tort. The fraud claim is not pled with any particularity. The conversion claim is preempted by California's Uniform Trade Secrets Act. The unfair competition claim is entirely dependent on WFG and others' insufficient claims, and the unjust enrichment claim is not independent cause of action in any of the events is also preempted by CUTUS, which is going to be this California Uniform Trade Secrets Act. For each of these reasons,